In front of 40 people, billionaire Olivia Harper threw a folder across the conference table and stared down Ryan Carter, her best strategist and a single father raising an 8-year-old girl on his own. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they already know how a story ends. You think anyone out there would pay you what I pay you? If you're so good, quit. I dare you. You won't. The room went silent. 40 people stopped breathing at the same time. Ryan didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He reached for a pen, signed something on the table in front of him, and stood up. Olivia's smile didn't move yet. It would in about 90 seconds, and it would never fully come back. What she didn't know, what nobody in that glass tower knew, was that 3 miles across town, a little girl named Amara was drawing a picture of her father at a desk with a crown on his head, because that was how she saw him. She didn't know what he did all day. She only knew he came home tired and still found the energy to check her homework, still found the patience to braid her hair before school when the sitter couldn't come, still found a way to make Tuesday feel like it mattered. In an hour, Ryan Carter was going to walk out the safest thing in his life, carrying a paper box that used to hold printer paper. He had no plan, no backup offer, no guarantee that the bills would still get paid in 30 days. He only had one thing left that Olivia Harper had never managed to take from him: his name, still attached to his own work. Stay with this one, because before it's over, the woman who dared him to leave is going to drive across an entire city, sit in a folding chair at a room she doesn't own, and ask him for something she swore she would never ask anyone for again. But that's later. First, you need to understand what it cost him to get there. 6:15 in the morning, and the apartment on the 3rd floor was already awake. Ryan Carter stood at the stove in a T-shirt with a coffee ring on the sleeve, flipping eggs with one hand, and holding his phone against his shoulder with the other, scrolling through an email chain that should have been resolved the night before. Behind him, small feet padded across the kitchen tile. "Daddy, my sock is a hole." He didn't look up from the pan. "Which sock?" "The one with the stars." "Then we're the one with the moons." "Nobody's checking your socks, baby. Miss Ferris checks. Miss Ferris has 40 kids to worry about. She's not counting your socks." He slid the eggs onto a plate and set it down in front of her booster seat. "Eat. We've got 20 minutes. Amara Carter was 8 years old, missing her top front tooth, and possessed a specific, unflinching honesty that only children have before the world teaches them to soften things. She ate her eggs in the deliberate way she did everything, chewing slowly while she studied her father like he was a puzzle she hadn't finished solving yet. "You worked late again," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "Is your boss mean?" Ryan almost laughed. He caught himself, because the true answer wasn't something you handed to an 8-year-old over breakfast. "She's demanding," he said instead. "That's different." "What's the difference?" "Demanding means she wants a lot. Means she doesn't care how she gets it." Amara considered this the way she considered most things, with total seriousness. "Which one is she?" Ryan turned back to the sink, so she couldn't see his face for a second. "Eat your eggs, Mimi." That was the whole conversation. It would come back to him later, sitting in his car with a resignation letter folded in his jacket pocket, because an 8-year-old had asked him a question he'd been avoiding asking himself for 7 years, and she'd asked it with a fork full of eggs halfway to her mouth, like it was nothing. Ryan drove her to school first, the way he did every morning, cutting through downtown traffic in a used sedan with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light he'd learned to ignore. He walked her to the gate himself, crouched down to fix her backpack strap, and reminded her that Tuesdays meant he'd be late picking her up, that Mrs. Delgado next door would get her at 3. "Will you still tuck me in?" Amara asked. "Always," he said, "no matter how late." She kissed his cheek, quick and unceremonious, the way kids do when the affection is real and doesn't need performing, and ran off toward the doors without looking back. Ryan watched until she disappeared inside, the same way he did every single morning, and then he drove downtown to a glass tower where none of that softness was allowed to follow him through revolving doors. The Harper Group occupied the top 11 floors of that tower, and everyone who worked there understood the rules without being told. You arrived early, you left late, and you never, under any circumstance, made Olivia Harper look like the second smartest person in the room. For most of the staff, This was simply the price of a good salary. For Ryan, it had become something closer to a daily discipline, a way of swallowing what he actually thought and doing the work anyway, because the work was the one thing in that building nobody could take from him. Ryan was 38. For almost 7 years, he'd been turning other people's failing ideas into things that made money. He was a man they called when a launch was 2 weeks from collapse, when a client threatened to walk, when numbers stopped adding up and nobody wanted to say so out loud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't chase credit. He solved the problem quietly and moved on to the next one. Over time, the entire building had come to lean on him without quite admitting it to themselves. Daniel Brooks, who sat 2 desks over and had learned half of what he knew just from watching Ryan work, liked to joke that the company ran on 2 engines and only one of them showed up on an org chart. It was a joke, but nobody laughed at it like it was only a joke. They'd all seen the pattern too many times to pretend it was luck. Olivia had seen it too, and that was precisely the problem. She'd built her fortune from nothing anyone handed her, clawing her way up through rooms full of men who assumed she'd fail. Somewhere in that long climb, she decided a company was only as strong as the person standing at the very top of it. A star employee wasn't an asset to her. He was a risk. He was proof the machine could run without her hand on every single lever, and she had spent too many years being underestimated to ever let herself be made replaceable again. So she watched Ryan the way you watch a rival you can't yet fire, and she made sure he understood his place. She never said it out loud, but she had a particular contempt for the fact that he was raising a household alone. In her mind, it made him predictable. A man carrying that kind of weight didn't gamble. He didn't walk away from a paycheck. He endured, and a man who endured, she believed, could be pushed exactly as far as she cared to push him. For years, she tested that theory in small, deliberate ways. She'd strip his name off a proposal and present his strategy as her own instinct in the boardroom. She'd let him carry a project across the finish line and then thank the junior staff for the win right in front of him. She'd correct him on points he'd never gotten wrong, just to see if he'd argue. He never did, and she took his silence as proof she'd read him correctly all along. Ryan absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, without a visible crack. Every morning on the drive in, he told himself the same thing. The money mattered more than the pride. There were obligations at home that made his own feelings a luxury he couldn't currently afford. It was a reasonable thing to tell himself. It had carried him through a divorce he never talked about at the office, through the slow, grinding years of rebuilding a life on one income, and had never once failed to get him through the doors of that building. But reasonable things were thin when you repeat them long enough. Lately, he'd started noticing the cost. He noticed it in the way the younger staff had stopped expecting fairness, having learned from watching him that talent was something you gave away for free in that building. He noticed it in a tiredness that had nothing to do with hours worked, and he noticed it most sharply on the days he did his very best work, because those were the days Olivia seemed most determined to prove that his best was worth nothing at all. The breaking point, when it finally came, wore the disguise of an ordinary Tuesday. There was a client account worth nearly $4 million a year that had been quietly falling apart for a month while the assigned team kept insisting everything was under control. It wasn't. The client was 3 days from signing with a competitor, and the only reason anyone knew that at all was because Ryan had spent 2 sleepless nights reading between the lines of emails nobody else had bothered to read carefully. He rebuilt the entire proposal from the ground up. He caught the pricing error that had insulted the client in the first place. He restructured the deliverables and personally drafted the recovery pitch that Olivia would stand up and deliver the next morning. He did it without being asked and without expecting thanks, because by then he'd stopped expecting thanks. He did it because the alternative was watching a good account die out of somebody else's pride, and that was a thing he had never learned how to tolerate. The pitch worked. The client stayed. For a few hours, the whole floor had the particular electric energy of people who knew they'd just dodged a disaster. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder and told him he'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat again, and for one unguarded second, Ryan let himself believe that maybe this time it would be acknowledged for what it actually was. Olivia called a meeting the next morning to celebrate the save. The conference room filled with the leadership team and a good chunk of the staff. Everybody pleased. Everybody waiting to hear the account held up as proof of what this company could do. Ryan sat near the middle of the table, nodded the head, and told himself he didn't need his name spoken aloud. He only needed the thing to be true. And it was true. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Olivia stood at the front of the room and walked everyone to the save like she was narrating a film about her own instincts. She described how she'd seen the danger early, how she'd known the pricing was wrong, how she'd personally directed the recovery. She used the word "we" the way powerful people use it when they mean "I." And with every sentence, she quietly erased one more of Ryan's fingerprints from the work, until by the end of it, he'd become nothing more than a set of hands that had typed what she supposedly dictated. He might have let even that pass. He'd let worse pass before. But then someone from the client's side, a man on the video call who meant no harm at all, asked honestly who had actually caught the pricing error, because he wanted to send a note of thanks. It was a simple question. The whole room knew the answer. For one suspended second, that answer hung in the air, waiting to be spoken. Olivia smiled and said these things were never about one person, that she didn't believe in singling people out, that the strength of the Harper Group had always been that nobody was irreplaceable. She said it looking directly at Ryan. Everyone in that room understood exactly who the last part had been aimed at, like a small, precise blade slipped in between the ribs where nobody else could see it land. Daniel's jaw tightened beside him. Somewhere down the table, a chair creaked as someone shifted, uncomfortable, and said nothing. Ryan felt something in his chest go very still. It wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was a quiet arrival of the fact he'd been refusing to look at for years, that no amount of good work would ever be enough, because being seen was never something Olivia intended to allow. He had been solving her problems in exchange for a respect that was never going to come, and he had spent 7 years calling that arrangement a job. She wasn't finished. Maybe she read his stillness as the old submission and wanted to press the advantage. Maybe she simply enjoyed having an audience. She set both hands flat on the table and leaned forward, her voice dropping into the light. Cutting register, she saved for moments when she wanted a lesson to land in front of witnesses. "Let's all be clear about something," she said, sweeping her eyes across the room before settling them back on him. "Loyalty isn't the same as leverage. Some people confuse being useful with being important." She let that sit for a beat. Ryan does good work. Ryan also knows exactly what a man in his position is worth on the open market, which is why Ryan is never going anywhere. She smiled. "Isn't that right?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that a few people looked down at their hands. Then she pushed a folder in front of her a few inches across the table, a gesture of dismissal more than anything, and delivered the line she'd clearly been saving. "You think anyone out there would pay you what I pay you?" she said. "If you're so good, quit. I dare you." "You won't." The room did not breathe. It's one thing to belittle a man's contribution in private. It's another to stand in front of 40 people and dare him to leave. And even the leadership team seemed to understand she stepped over a line that couldn't be easily stepped back across. Olivia, for her part, looked entirely certain. She had run the numbers on him 1,000 times in her head. A man with obligations, a single income, a mortgage, a daughter who needed picking up at 3 o'clock every day of the week. A life built on the reliability of that paycheck. He would flush. He would go quiet. He would stay. They always stayed. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not what she expected. There was no flush, no scramble, no fear. There was something almost like relief, the expression of a man who has finally been given permission to stop pretending. He gathered the papers in front of him into a neat stack, squared the edges out of pure habit, and stood. "All right," he said. Just that. 2 words, unhurried. Then he walked out of the conference room while it was still silent behind him. For several seconds, nobody understood what had happened. Olivia let out a short laugh and told the room to take 5, waving a hand like the whole thing had been a bit of theater she'd orchestrated on purpose. She believed it, too. She believed he'd gone to cool off in the restroom, that he'd come back with his eyes lowered, and that the story would end the way it always ended, with her proven right about human nature. But Ryan didn't go to the restroom. He went to his desk, and on the way, he stopped at a supply closet and took out a flat paper box, the kind used for filing. He began to fill it. He took the small brass clock that had sat on the corner of his desk since his first week and wrapped it in a sheet of paper before setting it inside. He took the pen his first mentor had given him. He took the small potted plant that had somehow survived 7 years on his windowsill. He took the coffee mug that had lost its handle years ago and been glued back together twice, because Amara had given it to him for Father's Day when she was 5, and it said "World's Okayest Cook" on the side, and it made him laugh every single morning, and he was not leaving it behind. Daniel appeared at the edge of the desk, watching him with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and something close to admiration. "Ryan," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry across the floor. "Man, don't let her do this. She'll say anything to get a reaction. Walk it off. Come back in an hour and she'll act like it never happened." "I know she will," Ryan said. He didn't stop packing. He worked with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything, and that calm was somehow more final than any outburst could have been. "That's the problem, Daniel. She'll pretend it never happened, and then it'll happen again, and I'll pretend too. And one day I'll look up and realize I taught everyone in this building that this is how you get treated when you're good at your job." Daniel had no answer for that, because it was true, and he'd felt the edges of the same truth himself more times than he wanted to admit. He watched Ryan lift the box, test its weight, and set back down to sign one last document, a resignation letter. 1 page, handwritten, no complaint in it, and no explanation. Ryan had drafted a version of it in his head 100 times over the years, without ever believing he'd actually write it. Writing it now took less than 2 minutes. Word moved through the floor the way bad news always does, quietly and fast. By the time Ryan walked toward the elevators with a box under one arm, a good part of staff had drifted out of their seats to watch. Nobody spoke. There was a strange gravity to the sight of him, the most capable person any of them had ever worked with, carrying the whole of his tenure out in a container that used to hold printer paper. Olivia stepped out of the conference room in time to see the elevator doors sliding shut. She'd expected to find him back at his desk, chastened. Instead, she found her entire staff standing frozen in silence, and a paper box already gone. For a fraction of a second, something crossed her face that she would deny to anyone who asked. A flicker of genuine uncertainty. Then she smoothed it over with the expression she wore for the board and the press, the one that never admitted to being surprised by anything. "Well," she said, loud enough for the floor to hear, "I suppose we'll find out how good he really is." A thin smile settled on her lips. "Give it a week. He'll call. They always call." She turned back toward her office like the matter was closed, like the number she'd run on him could not possibly have been wrong. Ryan set the resignation letter on the corner of the reception desk on his way past, because leaving it there felt cleaner than mailing it. He didn't look back at the office, and he didn't look back at Olivia. The elevator door slid open, and he stepped inside, and in the polished metal of the wall, he caught a blurred reflection of himself holding the box. A man who had just walked away from the safest thing in his life with no plan, no guarantee, and no idea whether he'd just been brave or foolish. The doors closed. The floor numbers began to fall. Somewhere above him, Olivia Harper was already telling herself the story in which she came out right. And somewhere below him, in a city full of people he'd never met, a version of the future was quietly beginning to take shape, one he couldn't see yet. He felt the cold, clear weight of everything now sitting on him alone. The bills that would arrive on schedule, whether or not he'd proven a point. The mortgage. The tuition deposit for the fall program Amara wanted to try. None of it cared about his pride. But underneath the fear, there was something he hadn't felt in years. Something that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with a man in that blurred reflection. For the first time in a very long time, he had stopped enduring. Whatever came next, it would be his. He picked Amara up himself that day. Mrs. Delgado had already collected her from the after-school program, and when Ryan pulled up the neighbor's front steps 2 hours earlier than usual, Amara came running down the walk with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders and an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. "Daddy, you're early." "I am," he said, crouching to catch her as she barreled into him. "Did they let you go home early?" He held her for a second longer than he needed to. Something like that. That night, after the dishes were done and her homework was checked and the third bedtime story had been negotiated down from a demanded fifth, Amara lay in bed with the covers pulled up to her chin and studied her father's face the way she always did before sleep took her, like she was memorizing something important. "Daddy," she said, "you seem different tonight." "Different how?" "Lighter," she said, "like when you put down the grocery bags." Ryan sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, turning that over. An 8-year-old had just described, more precisely than any consultant or therapist could have, exactly what happened to him that day. "I quit my job today, Mimi," he said finally. There was no good way to say it. So he said it plainly, the way he tried to say most things to her. Amara's eyes widened slightly, but there was no fear in them, only the careful processing of new information. "Because your boss was mean?" "Because she was both," he said. "Demanding and mean." Amara thought about this for a while, tracing a small finger along the edge of her blanket. Then she asked a question that would follow him for weeks afterward, the one line that would land harder than anything Olivia Harper had ever said to him across a conference table. "Does that mean you get to pick me up every day now?" Not, "Are we going to be okay?" Not, "How will we pay for things?" Just that, the only thing that had ever really mattered to her, offered up without any weight of judgment at all. Ryan had to look away from her for a second and clear his throat before he answered. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I think it does." "Good," she said, already half asleep. "You're better at the pickup line than Mrs. Delgado. You always know which snack I want." He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, and he sat in the hallway outside her door for a long time afterward, not moving, just breathing, because somewhere between the folder Olivia had thrown across the table and the 8-year-old sentence that had just landed on him like a soft hand, he understood something had shifted permanently. The first week passed exactly the way Olivia predicted, and she made sure everyone knew she predicted it. When no message came on Monday, she said he was proud. When none came by Wednesday, she said pride was expensive, and he'd learned that soon enough. By Friday, she'd stopped mentioning him at all, which she presented as indifference, but which the floor read correctly as the first sign the silence was starting to bother her. At home, the first week looked very different. Ryan spent his mornings at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cold cup of coffee, mapping out what he actually knew how to do without a company logo attached to it. He called 3 former clients, not to pitch them anything, just to check in, the way he'd always done, because he genuinely cared whether their businesses were doing well. 2 of them asked, almost as an afterthought, what he was up to these days. He told them the truth. He'd left the Harper Group. He was figuring out his next move. Both conversations ended the same way, with a pause, and then a version of the same sentence. "If you ever start something on your own, call me first." He hadn't asked for that. He hadn't even hinted at it. It simply happened twice in 1 week, and it planted something in him that hadn't been there before. The second week did not go the way the first had gone for Olivia, though nothing dramatic happened. It was that a great many small things stopped happening. The invisible maintenance Ryan had performed for years without anyone logging anywhere. A client email went 3 days without the kind of answer that used to arrive within the hour. A proposal went out with a pricing structure nobody had thought to double-check. A junior analyst spent an entire afternoon stuck on a problem Ryan would have untangled before lunch, and there was no one left to ask. Daniel felt the gap most directly, because he was the one people came to now, and he was honest enough with himself to know he was standing in a doorway built for a larger man. He did his best. He stayed late. He answered what he could and covered for what he couldn't. But covering was not the same as solving, and every day the distance between those 2 words grew a little wider and a little harder to hide. Olivia noticed the way a person notices, whether first as a change in light, and only later as a storm. The account Ryan had saved began to wobble again within weeks, because the recovery he'd engineered had needed a steady hand to maintain it, and no steady hand remained. The client, sensing drift, grew cool. A different account, one nobody had been watching closely, quietly slipped toward a competitor, while everyone's attention was elsewhere. She responded the way she always responded, by working harder and demanding everyone around her do the same. She sat in on meetings she used to skip. She rewrote proposals herself late into the night, and discovered that the parts she'd always assumed were only easy because someone else had spent years making them look that way. She would never have said this out loud to a single living person, but alone in her office with the city dark below her, she began to understand exactly what had walked out of the building carrying a paper box. She learned where he'd gone in the worst possible way. From a client, not a rumor. She was on a call trying to reassure an account that had grown nervous. And the man on the other end mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd recently spoken with Ryan Carter about some strategy work. Did she know Ryan had started his own firm? He said it warmly, the way you mention a mutual acquaintance, with no idea that every word was landing like stone. Olivia kept her voice level through the rest of the call. The moment it ended, she set the phone down very carefully, as though a loud sound might make the thing more true. Ryan had not gone home to lick his wounds. He had not spent 3 weeks composing an apology. He had spent them building something, and he had done it quietly. The first she heard of it was a client casually informing her that her best strategist was now available to the entire open market. The firm was small at first, barely more than Ryan, a phone, and a rented desk in a shared workspace tucked between a coffee roaster and a bank branch. But small was not the same as struggling, and struggling was what she'd been counting on. She had built her entire prediction on the assumption that his value came from the platform she'd given him, that without the Harper Group's name behind him, he'd be just another consultant sending emails nobody answered. It had never once occurred to her that the name people actually trusted might have been his the whole time. For Ryan, those first weeks weren't a triumph. They were fear held at arm's length by work. The obligations he'd walked away from didn't shrink just because he'd made a brave choice. And there were nights he sat with a spreadsheet of his own finances and felt the full, cold arithmetic of what he'd done. A man doesn't undo 7 years of dependence on a salary in a month. There were mornings he woke long before dawn and lay in the dark doing the math on how long his savings would last if the phone never rang. And mornings after that where he had to physically make himself get up, shower, and drive Amara to school like everything was fine. Because everything had to look fine for her, even on the days it didn't feel that way at all. But the phone did ring. It rang because of a thing Olivia had never understood about him. In 7 years of saving her accounts, Ryan had been quietly building relationships she'd always assumed belonged to the company. The clients he'd talked off ledges remembered, who had actually talked him down. The counterparts who'd watched him fix what others broke remembered his name, not the logo on his business card. When word moved that he'd gone independent, a handful of those people didn't hesitate, because they'd never really been loyal to the Harper Group at all. They had been loyal to him. His first real client was a mid-sized company that had worked with the Harper Group years earlier and left unhappy for reasons they'd never quite been able to name, until Ryan sat across from them and named those reasons precisely. He walked them through exactly where their strategy had gone wrong and what he'd do differently. And he did it without a single slide about himself. They signed within the week. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to prove the one thing he most needed to prove, that the value had never lived inside the building he'd left. He came home that night and told Amara over dinner, in language he could understand, that he'd gotten his first real customer. She didn't fully grasp what that meant, but she understood the tone of his voice, and she grinned around a mouthful of rice and said, "Does that mean we can get the good cereal now?" "Not yet," he laughed. "Soon." "I'll wait," she said, with the solemn patience of a child negotiating a long-term contract. "But I'm keeping track." The work suited him in a way the old work never had, because for the first time in 7 years, the credit and the responsibility sat in the same pair of hands. When something went well, there was no one left to take it from him. When something went badly, there was no one to blame it on either, and he found he preferred that arrangement even on the days it frightened him. He was tired in a way that felt earned instead of hollow, and that difference, small as it sounded, was a whole reason he'd walked out in the first place. Back at the Harper Group, the shape of the problem was becoming impossible to reframe. Revenue for the quarter came in soft, and soft was a word Olivia's board did not like to hear. 2 accounts that slipped had been long-standing, the kind everyone assumed were permanent. When leadership tried to trace why they'd gone, the honest answer kept circling back to a single absence nobody wanted to say out loud in front of her. Sophia Reyes, one of the sharper minds left on the strategy team, was the first to draw the obvious conclusion and act on it. She'd watched the conference room scene along with the rest of the floor, and she'd drawn a lesson from Olivia would not have wanted taught. If the best of them could be dared to quit and then discarded with a smile, loyalty in that building bought a person exactly nothing. Sophia had a career to think about. She didn't make a scene. She simply took a call from a recruiter she'd have ignored a month earlier, and she started listening. The mood on the floor curdled into something Olivia could feel but couldn't command. People still did their work, but they did it with a kind of quiet reservation, holding a part of themselves back the way you do in a place you decided not to trust. They'd all understood, watching Ryan go, that the company would rather humiliate its best than admit it needed him. And there is no memo that undoes a lesson like that once the whole staff has learned it. Olivia tried to solve the problem the way she solved every problem, by throwing resources at it. She authorized an expensive search for a senior strategist to replace what she'd lost. She interviewed impressive people with impressive backgrounds, and one by one, they failed to be the thing she was actually looking for. They could read a market, build a deck, speak with confidence in a room. None of them had the particular instinct for a client on the edge, the ability to hear the fear underneath an email and answer it before it became a decision. She had assumed that instinct was common. She was learning, slowly and expensively, that it was not. Meanwhile, the clients kept drifting, and now they were drifting toward a specific destination. It was one thing to lose an account to the general churn of business. It was another to learn that a client you'd held for years had chosen, deliberately, to bring its work to a one-man firm run by the man you dared to quit. Each defection carried a message that had nothing to do with price or terms. It was about trust, and trust was the one thing Olivia had never learned how to buy. She got the confirmation she'd been dreading on a gray afternoon when Catherine Vaughn came to her office without an appointment. Catherine sat on the board and had backed Olivia more fights than either of them cared to count, which had earned her the right to say hard things plainly. She sat down across the desk, declined the offer of coffee, and laid out the quarter's numbers in the flat voice of someone who had already decided the conversation was necessary. "I'm not here to lecture you," Catherine said, and the fact that she felt the need to say so made clear a lecture was exactly what this was. "I'm here because the board is asking questions I don't have good answers to. We lost the Delqua account. We lost half of Whitman. Both of them went to the same place. And I think you know what place that is." Olivia said clients came and went, that the market was soft across the sector, that a single quarter proved nothing. She said it well, because she'd spent a lifetime saying such things well. But Catherine had known her too long to be managed. "Olivia," she said, "I sat in more than one meeting where that man saved an account this company had already written off. I watched you take the credit. And I said nothing, because it wasn't my business and the results were good." Her voice stayed even, and that evenness was worse than anger would have been. "It's my business now. You didn't lose a strategist. You handed one to the open market and told the whole industry he was available. And they believed you because you were right. He is that good. That was never questioned." The words landed somewhere Olivia had been careful never to look. She had built her entire identity on the belief that no one under her was irreplaceable, because a woman who had once been treated as replaceable herself could not afford to believe otherwise. To admit that Ryan had been the exception was to admit that her deepest rule about power had a hole running straight through it, and she wasn't ready to admit that to Catherine, let alone to herself. So she did what she'd always done under pressure. She promised to fix it. She said she had candidates in the pipeline, a plan to stabilize the accounts. Catherine let her say it, and then stood to leave with an expression that made clear she hadn't come to ask for a plan. She'd come to deliver a warning. At the door, she stopped and turned back, and what she said next was quieter than everything before it. "The thing about respect," Catherine said, "is that it's cheaper than any of this. It would have cost you a sentence in that meeting. Now it's costing you the company." Then she was gone, and Olivia was alone with the numbers, the dark window, and the growing, unwelcome understanding that she had been wrong about the one thing she had been most certain of in her entire life. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She sat still and let herself think, without immediately converting the thinking into action. She replayed the conference room. She heard herself deliver the dare. She saw the strange relief on his face. She watched the paper box go into the elevator. She had told the whole floor he would call, and she had believed it. And every single day since had been a slow, quiet disproving of that belief. He was not going to call. She had understood that for a while now, without ever saying out loud. What she hadn't yet let herself understand was the part that would take longer, the part Catherine had put a name to. She had confused being feared with being needed, being useful with being important. The very distinction she had thrown at Ryan across that table like an insult. He had been the useful one in her telling of it, the hands that did what they were told. But usefulness that cannot be replaced is not usefulness at all. It is importance. And she had held importance in her hands for 7 years and spent that entire time trying to make it feel small. Across the city, in a rented office that was already starting to feel too small for what was happening inside it, Ryan closed his laptop on a day that had ended better than it began. His firm had a name now, a second client, and a third close to signing. The fear hadn't vanished simply because the work was going well, but it had changed character. There is a difference between the fear of a man who has been trapped and the fear of a man who has taken a risk. Even when from the outside, they can look exactly the same. He had come to know which one he was living inside now. He didn't think about Olivia often, which would have surprised her, because by then she was thinking about him constantly. When he did think of her, it was without heat, the way you think of whether you've finally driven out of. He didn't want her to fail. He didn't need her to. What he'd really been chasing all those years, he'd come to realize, was revenge, and it wasn't even recognition. It was a plain, ordinary dignity of being valued for what he actually brought to a room. And he had that now, in a place where his work belonged to him. Weeks kept turning into months. It took another 6 weeks for Olivia to exhaust every other option, and she exhausted them in order, the way a proud person always does. She hired the most impressive candidate to come out of her search, and watched him fail to hold an account he didn't understand. She lowered prices to keep a client who left anyway. She called in favors that had only ever been favors as long as she was winning. When the last it was spent, she sat alone in her office one evening with an address written on a slip of paper and understood there was nothing left to try except the one thing she had sworn years ago she would never do. She didn't tell Catherine. She didn't tell the board. She drove herself across the city the next morning, which was itself a strange thing, because she was a woman who was driven places, not one who drove herself. She found a shared workspace tucked between a coffee roaster and a bank branch on a street she'd never once had a reason to visit. The building had none of the polish of the glass tower she owned. Exposed brick, mismatched chairs, a front desk staffed by someone who didn't recognize her name when she gave it, and asked her to wait anyway. Ryan came out to meet her himself, which she hadn't expected. She had pictured being made to wait longer, being kept at a distance as a small, deserved revenge. Instead, he walked into the lobby in a plain shirt with his sleeves rolled up and looked at her with an expression that held no triumph in it at all. That was the part that unsettled her most. She had come braced for gloating, and there was none, and its absence made her feel the full weight of the visit more sharply than any insult could have. He showed her back to a modest conference room, offered her water, and sat across from her without hurry. The office around them was small but alive. Phones ringing. 2 people arguing amiably over a whiteboard to the glass, the particular electric energy of a place that was still growing into itself. She had walked in intending to be gracious from a position of strength, and somewhere between the front desk and this chair, the position of strength had quietly changed hands without her noticing exactly when. Olivia began with the version of the conversation she rehearsed in the car, the one that framed her visit as an opportunity she was generously extending. She told him the company had grown in directions that needed his particular talents. She told him she'd been thinking about how things had ended, and felt some of it had been unfair. She offered him his old role back, and then, watching his face give her nothing at all, she offered more, a senior title, a seat closer to the decisions, a salary well above what he'd made before. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't answer right away. He turned the glass of water a quarter turn on the table, and the small, ordinary gesture made clear he was actually considering how to say the thing, rather than whether to say it at all. "I appreciate that you drove out here," he said finally, his voice as level as it had been the day he walked out. "I know what it costs you to do it. I'm not going to pretend I don't." He met her eyes without any heat in his own. But the answer is no. Olivia had prepared for reluctance. She hadn't prepared for a refusal delivered so plainly, and her first instinct was the one that had always served her: raise the number. She said she could go higher on salary. She said equity was on the table, Real equity, the kind she'd never offered anyone before. She said whatever he thought he was building here, she could give him a bigger version of it inside a company that already had scale. It was never about the number, Ryan said, and the quiet in his voice stopped him more effectively than any volume could have. That's the part one don't think you've understood yet, and I'm not saying it to hurt you. I stayed for years because of the number. I told myself the money was worth what I had to swallow to earn it. I was wrong. It just took me a long time to see how wrong. He leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in something closer to honesty, like he decided she deserved the truth in full rather than the polite half portions people usually trade. I didn't leave because you underpaid me, he said. You didn't. I left because I was tired of being good at my job in a place where being good at my job meant standing there while someone told the room I hadn't done it. I left because I got tired of the kind of respect I had to earn back every single morning and lose again by the afternoon. You can't put that on the table, Olivia. It isn't a number. It's a thing you either extend to people or you don't. And for 7 years you decided not to. The words weren't cruel, and that's exactly what made them land. If he'd shouted them, she could have defended herself against the shouting, delivered evenly, with no wish to wound. They left her nothing to push against. She tried once more, and even as she did, she heard how thin it sounded. She said people said things in meetings. That pressure made everyone sharp. That surely he understood the demands of running a company that size. Ryan let her finish, then shook his head gently. The way you correct someone you stop being angry at. I do understand them, he said. I understood them the whole time. That's why I stayed as long as I did. But I'm not going to build my life around a place that only sees my value the moment it's gone. I have that value now. Somewhere my work is mine. I'm not giving that back for a bigger office. There was nothing left to offer after that, and Olivia was too intelligent not to know it. She gathered herself with the discipline that had carried her through 1,000 harder rooms, thanked him for his time in a voice that was almost steady, and stood to leave. At the door of the little conference room, she stopped. For once, she wasn't managing the moment or steering it toward an outcome. She simply looked at him. You're right, she said. The admission cost her something visible. I did decide not to. I'm not sure I even knew I was deciding it. Then she left, and Ryan watched her go without satisfaction, because being proven right about a thing that had cost him 7 years was not the same as winning anything. The drive back was long, and Olivia didn't turn on the radio. The refusal had done something the falling numbers hadn't quite managed. The numbers told her she'd made an expensive mistake. Ryan, in his plain shirt in his growing office, had told her what kind of mistake it was. And the two things were not the same. One could be fixed with a good quarter, the other one the root of how she'd run everything, and everyone for as long as she'd held power over anyone at all. The weeks that followed were the hardest she'd known in years, hard in a way that had nothing to do with revenue. The revenue was only a symptom. The disease was that she'd built a company people served without ever trusting, and now that the fear had cracked, the serving was cracking with it. Sophia Reyes handed in her resignation not long after. She did it calmly, and when Olivia asked her why, Sophia gave her the truth in a way no one on staff had ever dared before. I watched what happened to the best person here, Sophia said, standing in the office with her letter already on the desk. You dared him to leave, and then you smiled about it. I've spent every day since wondering what you'd do to the rest of us the moment we stopped being useful to you. I don't want to find out. She wasn't angry. She was clear, and clarity was harder to argue with than anger. Olivia let her go without the counteroffer she would once have reflexively made. 2 more capable people followed within the month, each for reasons that traced back to the same afternoon in the conference room. Olivia found herself presiding over a company hollowing out from the middle, losing exactly the people it could least afford to lose. And she understood, finally, that she could not hire her way out of a culture she had built with her own 2 hands. The problem had never really been a missing strategist. The problem was the reason the strategist had left, and that reason was her. Daniel Brooks was one of the few who stayed, though not out of blind loyalty. He stayed because he'd watched Ryan leave and had decided he wanted to see whether the place could become something worth staying for, and because someone who remembered how it used to be needed to be in the room while it changed. Olivia began to lean on him differently now, asking rather than dictating. And Daniel, to his own surprise, found a doorway he'd once felt too small for was one he could actually grow into once nobody was standing on his shoulders anymore. She did the only thing that had any real chance of matching. She stopped. She stopped rewriting other people's work and put her own name on it. Awkwardly at first, she began saying the names of the people who had actually done things, out loud, in rooms where it counted. It felt unnatural to her, like using a hand she'd never trained. More than once she caught the flicker of suspicion on a staffer's face, the reasonable doubt of someone who had learned not to trust kindness coming from her. She had earned that doubt. She made herself sit inside it rather than demand it disappear overnight. Catherine noticed a change before anyone else, because she'd been watching for it. Months after her first warning, she came to the office again, and this time she took the offered coffee and stayed a while, and what she said wasn't a lecture. "It's slower than losing them was," she observed, turning the cup in her hands. "That's how it always goes. You can lose trust in an afternoon. You buy it back a day at a time, and some of it you don't buy back at all." She looked at Olivia with something that wasn't quite warmth, but was no longer only judgment either. "But you're doing it. That's more than I expected." The company never recovered to what it had been. Olivia had to make peace with a smaller, steadier version of the things she'd built, one that no longer ran on fear and therefore no longer ran quite as hot. But the people who stayed began, slowly, to hold a little less of themselves back, and the difference was real even when it wasn't dramatic. She was becoming a leader she wouldn't have recognized a year earlier, for the plainest possible reason. The other way had failed in front of her own eyes, and this was the only way left standing. Across the city, Ryan's firm kept growing, and the growth had a shape that reflected the man running it. He hired carefully, and the people he brought on discovered quickly that this was a place where the person who did the work was the person whose name got said out loud. When something went well, he told the client exactly whose idea it had been. When something went wrong, he stood in front of it himself. He was building, deliberately and without announcing it, the precise opposite of the room he'd walked out of. Marcus Webb, who ran a company several times larger than anything Ryan had handled on his own before, became the client who turned the firm from a promising thing into a real one. He'd heard Ryan's name from two people he trusted and done the kind of careful checking men in his position do. And what he found convinced him. He brought Ryan a problem that was genuinely hard, the kind that could have gone badly and taken the young firm's reputation down with it. There were nights Ryan lay awake running the numbers on what a failure at that scale would cost him and Amara both. He didn't fail. He did the work the way he always had, without shortcuts and without theater, and he delivered a result that made Marcus Webb a client for years instead of a project. That single account did more than pay the bills. It proved that the thing Ryan had built could carry real weight, that the value people trusted had genuinely been his all along, never the borrowed shine of a glass tower. The last of the old fear finally began to loosen its grip on him. He and Olivia crossed paths again almost a year after he'd left, at an industry event neither of them could gracefully skip. He saw her across a crowded room, and the sight didn't tighten anything in his chest the way it once would have. She was speaking with a small group, and he noticed, watching for a moment, that she was doing something he had never once seen her do in 7 years. She was crediting someone else. She turned to a younger colleague and was telling the group plainly that the work they were discussing had been that colleague's idea, and she did it without being prompted and without making a performance of it. They spoke briefly later that evening, the way two people speak, when a great deal has passed between them, and most of it no longer needs saying. She told him the firm's reputation had reached her, that she was glad it was going well, and she meant it, which he could tell. He thanked her, and he meant it too. There was no grand reconciliation, no offer renewed, no closing of the distance that had opened between them. There was only a mutual, quiet respect that had been impossible when one of them held power over the other, and had become possible the moment neither of them did. "I owe you something," she said near the end of it, without drama. "Not a job. I know better than that now. I owe you the thing I should have said in that meeting and didn't. You were the best I ever had, and I spent all my energy trying to make sure you never knew it. That was a mistake. It just took losing you to finally teach it to me." Ryan received the words the way he received most things, without needing to make them into more than they were. He told her he was glad she learned it, and that he hoped the people working for her now got the version of her that had finally understood. Then the conversation found its natural end, and they moved back into their separate evenings. He didn't stay to watch her leave. He had nothing left to prove to her, and more importantly, nothing left to prove to himself. He walked out into the cool night with the ordinary tiredness of a man who had built something real and would be back at it in the morning. He thought briefly about the version of himself who had stood in that conference room a year earlier, holding a stack of papers and a decision he wasn't sure was brave or foolish. He knew the answer now. It had been both, the way most decisions that actually matter usually are, and it had been the right one anyway. He got home a little after 10, later than he liked. The apartment was dark except for the small lamp in the hallway that Amara insisted stay on, and he found her asleep sideways across her bed with a school project half-finished on the floor beside her, a poster board covered in crayon, titled in careful, uneven letters, "What My Dad Does." He crouched down and looked at it in the lamplight. She'd drawn a man at a desk. No crown this time, just a plain shirt with sleeves rolled up, surrounded by little stick figures she labeled clients and team, all of them smiling. At the bottom, in her handwriting, she'd written, "My dad helps people fix things that are broken. He used to do it for someone else. Now he does it for himself. And that's better because now everybody says thank you to the right person." Ryan sat on the floor of his daughter's room for a long time, holding that poster board in both hands, and let himself feel, finally, without needing to hold it at arm's length anymore, exactly how far the two of them had come. He carried her gently back into the center of the bed, pulled the blanket up over her shoulder, and she stirred just enough to mumble something without fully waking. "Daddy, did you fix something today?" "Yeah, Mimi," he whispered. "I think I finally did." She smiled in her sleep, the small, satisfied smile of a kid who'd never once doubted the answer, and turned over, and was gone again into whatever dream came next. Ryan stood in the doorway a while longer, the hallway lamp casting a long stripe of light across the floor, and thought about a paper box that used to hold printer paper, still sitting in a corner of his new office because he'd never gotten around to unpacking the last of it. He didn't need to unpack it anymore. He knew exactly what was in it. A clock, a pen, a plant that had survived 7 years despite everyone's best efforts to starve it of light, a coffee mug held together with glue that said something ridiculous on the side and had never once stopped meaning everything. He turned off the hallway lamp, the way he did every night, and went to bed in a life that finally, completely belonged to him. If the story stayed with you, remember what carried Ryan Carter through every single hard morning of it. It was never the title. It was never the salary. It was a little girl who never once asked what he did for a living, only whether he'd be there for the pickup line. Never measure a person's worth by what they're willing to swallow to survive. And never believe that money alone can hold someone who has stopped being respected. Treat people with dignity, and they will give you everything they have. Wound their self-respect long enough, and sooner or later, they will find the courage to build their own way, carry their own box out the door, and never look back. Some people call that leaving. Ryan Carter called it finally coming home.